Now, I'm not really sure where the usual band of right-wing outrage merchants thought they were going with their persistent derision towards Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, but I guess it's more about the journey than the destination anyway. I'm going to be such a puddle of sweat by the time this is done. Yeah, I know, 2 videos in a row, more or less, about bad media takes. I promise this isn't an overall direction for the channel, but a lot of stuff went on while I was on vacation, and I am still catching up, and I want to talk about the Odyssey, and more specifically, the right-wing outrage merchants who've ended up with a not insizable amount of egg on their face following months of them bad-mouthing the film ahead of its release, only for it to be extremely successful and pretty much negate their entire stated worldview that there's a big enough audience that hates black and trans people so much that they would skip a movie that these groups barely appear in. Now, what I'm not going to be doing is debunking the absurd takes from these guys that I'm going to be talking about. I'm actually going to have as few clips of these guys as I can get away with, because I doubt you want to look at their faces any more than I do, and I know you don't want to hear them. So I'm not really planning to just point at their ridiculous predictions of failure for the Odyssey and then laugh. All right, well, I can't promise I won't laugh at all. I might laugh a little, but that's not why we're here. There are plenty of videos out there of folks pointing out how full of crap these guys were, even well ahead of the movie's release, and there have been even more videos like that since. I don't need to add to that pile. Instead, I want to ask the question, how did this even happen? Now, you might be inclined to answer sort of dismissively, with some variant of, because these guys are complete clowns. Of course this happened. And that doesn't really ring true to me. Not that I'm saying they aren't clowns, they are. But I do think many of us have just mentally placed them in a box labeled bigoted idiots and walked away. And while that is honestly a very fair box to put them in, there is something else at play with their whole grift that I think folks like me have a tendency to not take into account. Because, and I know folks are going to push back on this, most of these guys aren't complete idiots. I'm not saying they're actually particularly intelligent, but I always like to distinguish between smart and clever. I don't think these guys are very smart, but most of the bigger names in this space are capable of being quite clever in how they go about their grift. They're applying that cleverness to a terrible thing, but it doesn't mean they don't have it. I think part of the reason so many of us are tempted to just dismiss these guys out of hand is because the things they say are absurd. And they are, to be clear. But it would only be worth fully dismissing their existence if you thought that they were sincere in their absurdity. The vast majority of these guys make their living feeding a rage machine of white patriarchal entitled aggrievement, and that income does not benefit from sincerity. It benefits from saying whatever best feeds that machine. Again, don't get me wrong, whatever they do think is probably more or less in line with the things they say. I am not suggesting that any of these guys are secret lefties. But being honest isn't part of the calculus of what they do. It's about playing to the audience they've built. And that audience has very specific expectations. And these guys being honest would only result in them ticking off their audience whenever an honest opinion isn't what that audience wants to hear. These guys don't want to be Trump getting booed at his own rally when he said people should take the COVID vaccine.
No, that's okay. That's all right.
So nothing they say should ever be taken as an actual honest opinion. These guys know the general points that they stick to, and they say whatever is in line with those far-right, racist, misogynistic, white supremacist perspectives, and whether or not they personally believe any given specific statement is of tertiary importance at best. A good shorthand for this is the way that they talk about movie critics. Every time a movie that they've decided to hate gets praise from critics, they declare that all those critics are shills and paid for their opinions and can't be trusted. But as soon as a movie they don't like gets bashed by critics, they will wave a bad Rotten Tomatoes score like a victory flag. But I thought critics couldn't be trusted. This isn't a contradiction to them. They say whatever serves their purpose. This is actually part of why I almost never talk about these guys in detail other than vaguely referencing them. And I pretty much never debunk them. I honestly don't really think there's very much value in talking about what they say as if it's a sincerely held belief. Some of their audience might sincerely believe some of this stuff, but that audience isn't open to being persuaded out of those beliefs. So I'm not sure who a debunking video is meant to help. Now, there might be some value in pointing out just what big liars these guys are in general, just to keep that reminder out there. But honestly, even that, after a while, just becomes making the same point over and over again. And for that reason, we're going to start with a really quick as I can make it, overview of what happened with these guys and Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, just for context. I'll go over some of this in more detail later, but let's just start with broad strokes. The grift mill kicked into high gear in early May when the false rumor that Elliot Page was going to play Achilles in the movie hit the net. Elliot Page, being an out trans man, is a favorite punching bag of these guys, so in response, they got all outraged over the rumored casting of a character it actually turned out wasn't even in the movie played by anybody, and then decided to throw in some racist objections to Lupita Nyong'o as Helen of Troy because they think Helen is supposed to be white, or indeed must be white. Helen, if you didn't know, is a woman who, in the original mythology, was hatched from an egg because her father was the god Zeus and knocked up her mom while in the form of a swan. But sure, it's skin tone these guys think is completely unreasonable to mess with. All of this segues into their purported claims that the movie lacked realism. They would throw in some token stuff about armor or boats to try and give credence to that notion, but ultimately, they'd always spend most of the time bitching about two women of color and a trans person just, being in the movie at all. They had actually kind of backed themselves into a corner on this, and I'll get back into how and why a little later. Anyway, they spent about a month and a half declaring that there was massive backlash to Nolan's woke take on the Odyssey, citing such ironclad data points as the dislike ratio on a trailer. They said it was going to be a disaster, that it would be a terrible movie. People would reject it. Just in case you haven't been keeping up, that did not happen. The film broke records with its IMAX ticket pre-sales, had the biggest opening day of the year up to that point, became the fourth biggest opening weekend for an R-rated movie in history behind only the Deadpool films. It's Christopher Nolan's biggest opening weekend ever, and it's Matt Damon's biggest opening weekend ever. And in its second week, it dropped only 27%, and then only 43% in its third week. And all of this at a time when only dropping 50% in the second week is considered a huge win. The critics loved it, audiences loved it, and these guys ended up with one of their biggest public L's in a while. And all of that actually kind of surprised me. To explain why, I'm actually going to take a little divergence because I sort of came at this whole topic sideways. Because while I was working on my obsession video that I put out last week, feel free to check that out if you haven't already, but while I was working on that, I did a quick check to see if any of the usual suspects of the woke Hollywood must be destroyed crowd had ended up giving a similar take to that of Alex Myers and other defenders of the character of Bear in that movie. Now, the funny thing is, most of them actually never talked about obsession. Nerdrotic, Heel vs. Babyface, Ryan Cannell, Clownfish TV, John Della Roz, Geeks and Gamers, if they talked about obsession at all, it was only to use its box office success as a stick to beat Star Wars and Supergirl with. So far as I could find from the usual suspects, it was basically only the critical drinker who watched it and subsequently recommended it, though he still had an extremely shallow take, so he did end up making it into my last video's clip montage regardless. But I was kind of surprised they were so quiet overall in the movie, given that the discourse by that time had turned to the question of whether the male lead was the bad guy or not, and you'd think this would be right in their wheelhouse to swoop in and say how accusations against Bear are completely in line with the brain-dead feminists and what they think about all men, or some such nonsense. But there was just nothing. And so I started thinking about why. Now, I suspect initially it was just because Obsession was an indie movie that was probably off most of their radars, because these guys by and large hyper-focus on mainstream stuff as much as possible for maximum algorithmic favoritism. But even after the film blew up and the conversation was everywhere, they still didn't touch it. And this was when I'd realized that I'd made the mistake that I mentioned earlier, and I'd kind of been assuming that they were as stupid as they presented themselves to be. But I recalibrated after this, and I think by and large these guys knew to stay out of the conversation around Obsession because it really wouldn't benefit them much. Because when I stopped and thought about it, these guys have actually been pretty shrewd and, as I said, clever with what they opt to target. Now, in hindsight, focusing on Marvel, Star Wars, and the parent company Disney was kind of a brilliant long-term strategy for them. Now, odds are they probably lucked into it at first, but I think it's foolish to assume that they didn't realize they had a really good thing going and knew how to work on stoking that very specific fire. Because if you actually cast your mind back to the backlash about Rey being the main character and John Boyega daring to exist at all in Star Wars The Force Awakens, at the time, while it was indicative of the kind of stuff that would become more common, it was largely brushed off and mocked. Same with the small handful of channels who decided to die on the hill of Black Panther is bad, actually, and we should have a character whose point is his whiteness. They were again largely mocked and ignored. But that turned out to be great for them in the long term to just keep bashing Marvel and Star Wars, because it was clear Disney was going to run both of these franchises into the ground, and that was always going to inevitably lead to road bumps, missteps, and diminishing returns. And when these things inevitably happened, here were the grifters, pointing out literally any representation present in these films and going, see, we told you these were woke and bad. You see it now, right? It was a terrific funnel for them, because if someone came out of, let's say, The Last Jedi and didn't like the movie, the loudest voices saying that it wasn't good were these guys. And a certain percentage of folks disappointed or frustrated with The Last Jedi, as I for one was and honestly still am, but I'm not going to dwell on that because I do plan to do a video down the line to actually dig into that a bit more at some point. But regardless, a certain percentage of that audience who was frustrated with the film are going to find these guys and end up going, you know, they make sense and maybe they're right about more things than just this movie we both don't like. And then boom, new audience funneled into the grift mill. And with Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar all being owned by Disney, that just made their jobs easier, because now anyone trying to call them on their bullshit find themselves having to partially defend one of the biggest corporations in the world, and it makes these guys look like underdogs, which was a huge boon for them, especially during the Biden years where their political side was technically out of power. Any single underperforming movie from any of these franchises or studios became proof that woke is dying. Any success was either manufactured, exaggerated, or somehow managed to come out unwokeified, and is the exception that proves the rule. Now, as I said, most of them lucked into targeting Star Wars and Marvel and having that work out really well for them in the long run. But it's not just luck. They've been honing their grift since then. Take the harsh treatment they gave to Supergirl. Now, betting against Supergirl was an extremely safe bet for them, because even before weekend estimates started getting downgraded, it was guaranteed to not make as much money as Superman did. And that alone was something they could spin to their ends. They may not have known just how much of a mess the post-production was or how badly it was going to underperform, but literally the only way that they would end up looking bad if they predicted its failure would be if Supergirl outperformed Superman, and there was just no way that was ever going to happen. Same thing with their targeting of The Mandalorian and Grogu. It was the world's safest bet for them to go after that one as soon as the marketing started ramping up, because while it performed Honestly, about what you'd expect for a film continuation of a TV series, which is a thing that pretty much never does exceptionally big numbers outside of a handful of animes. The whole thing could be framed as the biggest Star Wars bomb since Solo. Now, of course, Lucasfilm only spent half the budget on Mandalorian and Grogu that they did on Solo, so from Disney's end, this was perfectly fine that it wasn't doing as big numbers, but these guys don't care. It's just more numbers that they can spin. Lowest Star Wars box office since Solo is a punchy and technically accurate title. That's all they need. Actually, they don't even need to be technically accurate most of the time, but it is a boost for them if they are. Again, these are extremely safe bets for them to go after. They have gotten good at finding the low-hanging fruit that will make them look prophetic and like they know what they're talking about. This also applies to the things that they don't go after, because, by contrast, you can look at the videos put out by these channels on Spider-Man Brand New Day. The angle on this one has become how it's so big, it's embarrassing the rest of the MCU. Because they knew even going into this that it was going to be one of the biggest movies of the year. We all knew that, and it would be foolish to bet otherwise. So, they didn't. Their videos on that film are by and large neutral or using it as a means to say how the rest of the MCU is terrible and failing. But they aren't really targeting the movie itself the way they did with Supergirl and Mando Lothlorien. Because on paper, Spider-Man Brand New Day is loaded with the kind of stuff they hate. And some people might call out the hypocrisy of giving it a pass or more or less going softer on it. But again, remember, these are not sincerely held opinions. They don't care if they're hypocrites. They knew the movie would be successful and likely very popular, so they had to tread more carefully, and they did. Oh, and if you haven't noticed already, most of these guys have basically the same headlines, and some of them have nearly the exact same thumbnail format. I repeatedly kept mistaking Geeks and Gamers thumbnails for nerdrotic ones, and vice versa. Because you might not know, if you don't pay attention, and you shouldn't, all these guys are in each other's orbits. They all talk to each other. They're literally all running the same playbook, and they're in conversation. But if they've been pretty savvy about how they've run the grift up to now, and which movies they dance around, avoid, or target, how did they get it so wrong with the Odyssey? Because they went really hard on that movie, about on par with what they did with Supergirl and The Mandolin and Groglet. But anyone paying even the tiniest bit of attention should have seen it wasn't going to play out the way that those two did. And beyond that, these guys actually had a bigger problem. You see, even when they lie about the movies that they decide to slam, it doesn't really matter, because their audience is mostly going to skip these movies and shows anyway. They can claim whatever they want about what's in Supergirl or the themes of Supergirl or whatever, because nobody who watches them is ever going to see it. But Christopher Nolan is a director who mostly makes movies about obsessed men who channel their obsessions into violence. This is why he was such a natural fit for Batman. He's completely up the alley of these guys and their audience, the kind of director they usually like to praise as a respite from all the wokeness that they rail against. He's the kind of guy who makes movies their audiences actually go to, watch, and probably enjoy. And they know this. This is why a couple years ago, they had to treat Oppenheimer basically how they treated Obsession. Almost none of them reviewed it. If they brought it up, it mostly was just to use it as a way to rag on any given Disney flops from the same year. These guys, for the record, almost never praise anything. That's not what they're built to do. If they like a thing, that doesn't really feed the rage machine. Usually the closest they will come to praising something is when they decide to hype up whatever they think will annoy the people they don't like, which is how they end up trying to claim something like Citizen Vigilante is any good, which I will remind you is a movie directed by Uwe Boll, a man about which it has been uncontroversial to say for the last 20 years is the worst director to ever maintain a career. So, if they know all this, this, and they can usually spot what's going to be a hit, just like anyone who follows box office numbers and trends even a little bit. What the hell happened? Well, remember how I mentioned they kind of painted themselves in a corner over how they respond to the existence of trans and black people? Yeah, that's pretty much what did them in. So here's a more detailed timeline as I have been able to figure it out. By and large, these channels didn't really care much about the Odyssey until around May of this year. There were a couple of rumblings in these circles before that. John de la Rose complaining about the classicist whose work was reportedly an inspiration for Nolan. He did that the year before. Ryan Cannell and Nerdrotic jumped on the rumor of Lupita Nyong'o playing Helen around February, but they also didn't really stick with it because it wasn't confirmed yet, so they just kind of did one thing and moved on. Geeks and Gamers, after having been hopeful, if not openly excited about the project, did a couple of videos early in the year off the back of the first trailer, but compared to what comes later, this is all pretty small dribbles and mostly in the first couple months of the year. Then, on May 5th, the extended trailer for the film came out and contained this brief image of Elliot Page. Now, Page, who, like much of the cast, has worked with Nolan before, had been confirmed to be in this film some time ago. But this brief and, I guess, mildly aggressive appearance led to a lot of online speculation about who he was playing. And on the weekend of May 8th, one theory that he was playing the Greek hero Achilles, best known to audiences from the 2004 film Troy as portrayed by Brad Pitt, that theory started to gain traction and actually spread. So on May 9th, Geeks and Gamers talked about it on one of their cursed group call videos. The same day, John de la Rose did his first video directly about the movie, focusing on actress Lupita Nyong'o and Emily Wilson, the aforementioned classicist whose translation Nolan had cited. Now, Nyong'o's casting as well as Page had both been known for a while, but again, who she was playing was still just speculation at this point in the timeline. The very next day, Nerdrotic did his first video, bringing doubt to the movie. Even in these early videos, they hadn't really gone all in yet. They were opting to amplify some of the "it's not historically accurate" stuff that had been bubbling in the background since that first trailer, and they seemed to know that they couldn't go too hard quite yet. So their videos are all very early warning signs or "I'm kind of nervous about this" style stuff, something they could back away from later. And it's definitely pretty mild compared to where they're going to be going. Then on May 12th, Time magazine ran a piece on Nolan that included the information that Lupita Nyong'o was in fact playing Helen of Troy. And this appears to have been the breaking point. All of these guys came storming out the gates after this. And even those who hadn't been talking about the Odyssey at all before this, like Clownfish TV, jumped on the bandwagon at this point. Once the Helen news was confirmed, it was no longer just a rumor or, for them, a fear. They all seemed to come to the conclusion that if Nolan did that, then he almost definitely was having Page play Achilles as well. Now, these channels are run by guys who have staked their entire livelihoods on being anti-woke. And two of the biggest bugbears for that particular grift is racial recasting for what they believe should be a white character and trans people literally existing at all. And again, keep in mind, their opinions should not be taken as sincere. They say what they say to attain two things: engagement and money from their audiences, and to push a right-wing agenda. And if we're honest, that second one is the lower priority. If they thought there was more money to be made in being centrist, a bunch of them would be doing that. But getting money means saying what the audience wants to hear. And they have primed their particular audiences to hate racial recasting and trans people. So at this point, they really only had two choices. Stop talking about what was going to be one of the biggest movies of the year and a film their audience was more likely than most of the things they talk about to actually go out and see, or go all in on their woke destruction of Hollywood grift with the Odyssey, and they opted for that second one. Either from momentarily buying into their own bullshit, or being willing to roll the dice after 2 consecutive wins with Supergirl and Mando. The result is ultimately the same either way. And it was probably always going to be the case that if one went all in, they were all going to go all in. Because again, remember, these people know each other and talk rather frequently. Now, how much of them all saying the same things about the same properties at the same time is actual coordination and how much of it is copying off each other's homework, it doesn't really matter. Because these guys made a lot of videos about this movie. It's hard to say for sure exactly how many, because a whole lot of the videos are actually just 10 to 15 minute clips pulled out of live streams or Zoom calls, often with multiple of these guys appearing on any given one, since, as I said before, they all know each other. But generally speaking, it ranged from 9 videos on the low end to around 40 on the high end over the course of about a month and a half. It is interesting how the whole thing kind of snowballed as it went. Some of the initial stuff tried to claim that this was being forced on Nolan. Because again, he's the kind of director who makes stuff these guys usually like, or at least can't really farm outrage dollars out of. But as it went, they just had to keep going harder and harder, escalating every time, claiming the situation was getting worse. Otherwise, they couldn't justify talking about it again. They claimed there was a building backlash that simply didn't exist outside their bubble, that it was going to be some massive rewriting of the original work to please the supposed woke gods of Hollywood, and that the good early word was all being done by paid shills, that the movie was going to bomb. 2 days before the movie debuted in theaters, these guys were on Piers Morgan's show on Fox Nation to say how bad it was gonna be. And Fox is mainstream enough that it usually avoids actually platforming these online grifters. Outlets like Fox will talk about online backlash all day long, but they don't usually bring these guys on to speak because they're so comparatively unprofessional that it would make Fox look bad for having them on, especially since Fox's whole thing is putting a veneer of professionalism over their right-wing agenda. But here they were, on possibly the biggest platform they were ever going to get, being boldly wrong about a movie that everybody would know the truth about in 2 days' time. And then, of course, the movie came out, and everyone loved it, and the box office is through the roof. So now what for them? Well, a few of them actually got their reviews out before the box office numbers for that first weekend were in, and in those cases, they tried to say the movie was bad, or at least deeply compromised. But since then, since we've gotten the box office reports, they've been talking about it significantly less. And if they do, it's in a distinctly shifted tone. Things like, Hollywood will learn the wrong lesson from this, or hammering on specific people instead of the film as a whole, or claiming it's just Oscar bait, or whatever. But compared to how much they milked it for outrage dollars before the release, they have all gone comparatively silent. Geeks and gamers have barely put out anything, and I think it's pretty telling that one of the few things they put out was one of the people on their team being honest about the box office and saying, guys, I told you that this was always going to be huge, and the numbers on that video are not great. Pretty much all Nerdrotic has done since putting out reviews was the aforementioned Hollywood will learn the wrong lesson from this, which by its nature has to capitulate to the fact that the movie is a success. Ryan Canal and Heel vs. Babyface have been half-heartedly covering the box office numbers, with the latter trying to caveat it with, maybe there's gonna be a big drop-off and, well, there wasn't much competition, and the former even saying flat out that maybe mainstream audiences don't get as upset about the kinds of things folks on, quote, our side of the internet do.
I think they're much more satisfied with the movie than we are here on our side of the internet.
Which is actually a shockingly self-aware statement from one of these guys to actually say on camera. But it's a statement that exists because it has to. There's only so much reality that they could deny about this. John De La Rose has been opting to act shocked at each weekend of good box office news, like it was some unforeseeable event. Clownfish TV did a similar, oh, they're gonna learn the wrong lessons from this, as Nerdrotic did. And to be clear, it's not just a matter of the movie being out and not being a hot topic anymore. That's a factor to a certain extent, sure, but videos about the Odyssey are still pulling big numbers on YouTube, even now. Plus, these guys will still at least put Supergirl in thumbnails about anything they do on the DCU, probably for the rest of the year, if not beyond. The past few weeks have been really embarrassing for these guys. Their tails are tucked between their legs, and it's not just because people have been dunking on them. People always dunk on them. They don't care. It's embarrassing because their audience feels lied to. They got their viewers all geared up to celebrate another woke collapse that would be rejected by the masses, and instead, it's a beloved movie breaking box office records. For as much as these guys want to be seen as mavericks, it is vital to their grift that they don't piss off their audience or be made to look foolish. Foolish to that audience. I mean, they always look foolish to me. It's telling that while there are a handful of channels out there trying to claim that the box office numbers are actually fake somehow, it's not any of these guys. It's all either way smaller fish in the same pond, or guys like Tim Pool who are more general right-wing and conspiracy shitheads and not as much entertainment focus. These guys can't get away with saying it's a fake hit because too much of their own audience is going to see it because, again, were it not for like 3 casting decisions in a very large cast, this is a movie fully in line with what these people say they want. Perhaps the most telling thing of all is something I mentioned in my last video. Ben Shapiro actually praised this movie.
As a film, does it work? Absolutely.
It's worth noting that while the kinds of guys I've been talking about are way more focused on entertainment and specific and keeping the grift mill going on that than they are about actually furthering an overall political goal. Ben is the inverse of that. His political goals are very specific, and he really only brings up entertainment when it feeds into the politics he wants to push. And I'll repeat something that I said in my last video. I don't think Ben likes to lie about his media tastes. I won't say he's completely above it, but the guy wanted to be a screenwriter. He's a classically trained musician. He's written fiction. There's some part of him that still has an artistic spark. And when something connects to that, I don't think he wants to lie about it. So while the other guys that I've been talking about put out reviews being either tepid or calling it boring or some more or less neutral criticism,
I thought it was rather mid. I gave it a 5 out of 10 out of the theater.
or in a couple of cases trying to go all in on one last desperate attempt to claim that it was bad, Ben just flat out said it was good. He gave a token acknowledgement about not liking some of the casting, but otherwise recognized it as what most people saw. A really well-made movie. For as little respect as I have for Ben Shapiro, which is almost none, to be clear, between his not focusing almost exclusively on woke Hollywood stories and actually caring about art at least a tiny bit, despite his own repeated artistic failures and demonstrable lack of talent in most areas, it feels like he was able to be honest about the movie in a way that I could just never trust these other guys to be. Ben can say, it's really good, though there's some iffy casting, while these other guys have saddled themselves with a position that a single non-white character in a role they think should be white, and literally any trans person, means the whole thing must be condemned, even if the combined screen time of those actors amounts to less than 20 minutes in a nearly 3-hour movie. They can't modulate at all. Ben can, at least a little bit. The additional hiccup since the movie came out has been the revelation that classicist Emily Wilson, the one whose translation of the Odyssey Nolan cited as a partial inspiration, did not like the movie at all. It's something most of the channels I mentioned have opted to not talk about. Some of them have tried to find a way to spin it, but for the most part, they largely just seem confused with what to do with this. Obviously, on paper, they'd love for a translator with an academic background to say that the movie was bad, because that backs up their claim that the movie sucks despite its success. But of course, she's a woman. and they don't want to support her views if she isn't explicitly right-wing in some way. And it really is just about optics. These guys will say that she's somehow a woke or an outspoken feminist. There is truly no evidence of that. Not that I could find anyway. She's an academic who is, yes, the first woman to translate the book, and has spoken about how the simple observable fact that most translators before her all came at it with a comparable and very masculine perspective to each other, and she inherently brought a different one just by virtue of being a woman. But it's not really an overtly feminist translation, and I can't find much at all on what her actual political views are. But she's a visibly tattooed woman in a traditionally male-dominated field, so the gut instinct for these guys is to dismiss and mock her. You can hear how confused they are trying to talk about this.
At the same time, I find what she has as criticisms to be bordering close to a lot of the ones I had. It feels weird.
Also, look, I know I said I'd use as few clips as possible, but I can't help but highlight something here. I said before that it was foolish to think that these guys are as stupid as their stated beliefs and opinions. If there's an exception to that, it's probably heel versus babyface. Seen here looking utterly baffled that a woman is even talking. Heel is right there, pulling just the stupidest faces. It's worth remembering that while most of these guys built up their grift over time, learning the lessons I mentioned, heel versus babyface rocketed to prominence on the back of this memorable meltdown.
Fucking pronouns!
After that, he blew up so big so fast that he basically was allowed to join the club with the rest of them without having to learn any of the lessons that the rest of them appear to have taken on board over time. So when it comes to him specifically, he might actually be as big of an idiot as he comes across. But I still stand by my belief that it's a bad idea to assume that about all of them. Getting back on track, other than that hiccup with Emily Wilson, for the most part, these guys are already starting to shift their primary negative focus to Avengers Doomsday, which might work out for them. My own prediction for that movie is a huge opening, big drop-off, and these guys can spin that, and I expect they will, if and when it happens. Hell, for their purposes, all they really need to be back to business as usual is for Doomsday to make under $2 billion, which would put it behind Endgame and Infinity War. And if it doesn't break the $1.4 billion that Age of Ultron cleared, they can basically just declare victory. And while there's no certainty, it's a safer play than betting that the Odyssey was gonna flop. So since some of them are now focused on learning the wrong lessons, contents, and finding a new target, do I expect them to learn from all of this? No, not meaningfully at any rate. I mean, maybe it was a wake-up call that while they can spin a successful Marvel or Star Wars movie to fit their narrative almost regardless of anything, they can't get away with that on all things. But the truth is that lesson isn't even really going to be one that they really have to learn. How often do we get a movie that succeeds on this scale that isn't part of an established franchise? Yeah, they should have seen it coming. Yeah, they took a ding to whatever passes for credibility in their fields. But ultimately, the stars won't align for them to make this kind of screw up again anytime soon. Though, on the bright side, that probably means that a repeat of this is inevitable, if perhaps some years off, maybe with whatever Nolan's next movie will be. I'm also just going to note here that while I singled out like 6 of these channels, there are a ton out there who were also running the same playbook and hit the same wall. Shadiversity, Benny Johnson, Asmongold, Sidney Watson, The Quartering, and a ton of others that I don't know and don't care to. There was only so much I was willing to look into.
That is one big pile of shit.
This video was never going to be comprehensive. Take this as a representative sampling. Then what can those of us who aren't in this grift mill learn? Well, whether you're grifting or not, it's a reminder that if you build a platform on giving your audience exactly what they want and nothing else, then you're completely at the mercy of that audience. It traps you into needing to have the correct opinion for that audience, lest they turn on you or abandon you for someone who will tell them what they want to hear. And that's a lesson I, for one, took to heart a long time ago. I know my metrics. I know what kind of videos I could be doing that would do way bigger numbers than I usually get. I could talk about J.K. Rowling every time she makes another horrifying statement. I could hunt down the latest bit of nonsense that James Somerton has gotten up to. I could become a dedicated drama channel, and I would almost definitely make more money. But I'd also hate what I do. Now, if all you care about is maximum views, maximum engagement, maximum income, then what these guys do makes sense. But while I'm not prepared to say any of them have a particularly robust conscience, I do suspect they're, by and large, not very fulfilled by their work. Meanwhile, I really like this job, and everything else I'm able to do because of it, some of which has absolutely nothing to do with what I put out on this channel. I feel liberated by my work here. And whether or not these guys are prepared to admit it, to me, they all look trapped by their own channels, which sucks. They made this bed and they damn well deserve to lay in it, but just like conceptually, that sucks. Oh well. You actually want to know what the funniest thing about all this is? I still haven't even seen the Odyssey yet. Because the thing these guys had to say had nothing to do with the actual substance of the movie. So, unlike when I talked about Obsession, I felt no obligation to squeeze in a viewing before doing this video. Now, maybe I will get to the movie, maybe I won't. Maybe I've already seen it by the time you see this, and I saw it between shooting it and it coming out. But I haven't seen a Nolan movie since Interstellar. Not like as some kind of deliberate, I'm done with that guy choice. I don't know. I haven't felt the need. And I'm okay with that. So, the Grifters, they just played themselves on this one. What are your thoughts on any of this? As I said, if you want to find people who are just going to dunk on them for their specific opinions, plenty of places to do that. But what are your thoughts on my views on the overall picture? The bigger scope of what they are, what they do, and how they go about it. Whatever your thoughts might be, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills and is how I am able to do this as my living, and I cannot thank my supporters enough. It gets you access to my docket at the start of every month. It gets you access to videos like this early. It also gets you an increasing amount of Patreon exclusive content, such as me doing short essays on the top 100 movies listed on my Letterboxd account. The majority of these perks are also available if you support me on here as a YouTube member. Again, I appreciate it greatly. I'm starting to sweat, which means it's time for me to stop. But thank you again for watching, for listening, and please remember that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council, and I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Jared Boyce, Zubin Lutfula, Daphne Matthews, Kay Johnston, Auntie Kate 808, Mira G, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Snark Shark, Oliver B, Mystic Shadow, Sean Miller, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Magdalena, Melissa Pedersen, Becky Sparks, Twilord, Tracy Scrabbit, Palba Rabajoggle, Sir Didymus is my favorite, and additionally from the lower tiers of support, I'd also like to thank Isabel Lovelace, Hey Chica, and Lee Campo. What are you guys doing? Oh my goodness, who's back there? Oh, Worm, why do you do this? Ah!